Today we're talking about independent versus dependent clauses, specifically your ability to recognize them. Our objective is that you need to be able to label a clause as dependent or independent kind of instantly when you see it, in order to confirm if a sentence is complete or not, and if it's correctly punctuated or not. So just to review, in case it's been a while since you've heard this, or in case this is brand new to you for the first time, in the world of grammar, a clause is any group of words that has both a subject and predicate. And I've been doing some color coding on this slide for you, okay? There's two kinds of clauses though. Again, independent and dependent, and here's the difference. A dependent clause cannot stand alone, but an independent clause can. An independent clause expresses a complete thought. It's a complete sentence. For example, we ate an entire pizza. That's fine. It's complete and independent because it has a subject, we, and a predicate, ate an entire pizza. A dependent clause can't stand alone because it does not express a complete thought. In fact, it contains a subordinating conjunction, and the subordinating conjunction makes the sentence sound incomplete. It kind of sounds awkward, like it leaves you hanging. The presence of a subordinating conjunction, aka an AWUBIS word, kind of ruins everything. For example, before, we established that the sentence, we ate an entire pizza, was fine. But when you add a subordinating conjunction in the front of it, if you add the word because, now it's dependent. Now it's an awkward fragment. Like, listen to how this sounds. Because we ate an entire pizza, ... Do you feel that awkward pause, like you were waiting for me to finish the sentence or waiting for me to keep going? That's what dependent feels like. And that's why they're not complete. So a dependent clause has to be revised. You either have to get rid of the AWUBIS word so it's complete again, or you got to add more words to finish everything out. So let's talk about AWUBIS for a second, okay? AWUBIS is an acronym that someone else made up. I'm not taking credit. And AWUBIS stands for although, after, as, when, while, until, before, because, if, since. And I kind of memorized it as a little bit of a rhyme, or a rhythm rather. Although, after, as, when, while, until, before, because, if, since. These are not the only subordinating conjunctions, but these are the top 10 most common ones. So these are the ones worth memorizing, because knowing these 10 will help you recognize dependent clauses when they happen. Look at all 10 of these examples, okay? In each case, an AWUBIS word causes a chunk of words or a clause to be dependent. And since this underlined part is dependent, I need more words. I need an independent clause to go with it to make it complete. Okay? Here's another way to think about it. I like to imagine that AWUBIS words are actually the AWUBIS monster. And the AWUBIS monster is like a zombie, and when the AWUBIS bites a clause, it ruins it and makes it dependent. Kind of like how when a zombie bites you, you become a zombie also. So when the word although bites we were tired, now it's dependent. After the game, sorry, I should have written after the game ended. After the game ended would be a dependent clause. As the timer ran out would be dependent, so we'd need to add an independent clause. She scored one more point. And she scored one more point would be a complete sentence. So notice how I've got the zombie bite that ruins a dependent clause, so it needs to attach to an independent clause in order to be a complete sentence after all. So who cares why do we care about dependent versus independent clauses? It sounds boring. Well, actually, it affects more than one area of grammar, so we really have to care. First of all, we have to care about awubis words and dependent clauses because we want to avoid fragments in most of our writing, especially nonfiction writing or essays. You wouldn't want to write "because I was tired" as a complete sentence because that's actually a fragment. Dependent clauses are fragments. We also care because dependent clauses affect whether you can put a comma in a spot or not. For example, if you put the dependent clause first and then follow with an independent one, we almost always put a comma in between. For example, if you run, comma, the dog will chase you. So again, if the dependent clause comes first, we almost always put a comma after that introductory clause. It's also possible to put a dependent clause in the dead center of the sentence, in the middle, and that dependent actually interrupts an independent clause. So look at this one. The sentence should have been, "My teacher ate a calzone." But I've got a dependent clause interruption in the middle. Who loves pizza? Now, side note, technically you can have a dependent clause with a pronoun instead of an awubis word, but that's kind of a whole other story. Obviously, though, you can tell that if I just said to you, "Who loves pizza?" that's not complete. It sounds incomplete. It leaves you hanging. It's not a complete thought, so it's still dependent. Here's the tricky part. If you put the dependent clause second, the comma is less common. It is optional. I will help you because you asked nicely. There's no expectation for me to put a comma in this spot. Okay, so we talked about fragments and commas. We also need to care about independent versus dependent because we want to prevent run-ons. Again, it's encouraged to put a comma only between a dependent and independent clause. But if I only put a comma between two independent clauses, like in example B, that's a run-on. That's called a comma splice, and it's not good, friends. No one likes a comma splice. So I know this is kind of tricky, but again, a comma is okay between a dependent and independent, but it's not cool between two independents. So again, if you can recognize a dependent when it happens, you know if you're allowed to put a comma there or not. And finally, kind of related to all this, we care about independent and dependent clauses because they help us recognize what sentence type is happening. Most of the sentences I have shown you today, including these, are complex sentences. Complex sentences have one dependent clause and one independent clause. They have one of each. So, and technically, like, you can have a dependent clause in a compound complex sentence as well. But whenever you learn sentence types, it will be very helpful for you to know how to recognize dependent and independent when they happen. So let's practice a little. You might want to pause this video so that you can take a look at these 8 questions and decide, are these dependent or independent? And are these 3 sentences correct or incorrectly punctuated? Pause the video and see what you think. Hopefully you're back. Let's look at the answers together. So the clause, "if you want my opinion, ... that's dependent. An awubis word has bitten the clause if, and now it's incomplete. He told you not to is fine. this clause is independent. It's a complete sentence. There's no awubis word or relative pronoun to ruin things. Because I said so might sound kind of complete because it's sassy and we say it in dialogue, but it's technically dependent because, again, of that awubis word. Only the referee knows is independent, okay? But until the clock stops is dependent, because until is one of those subordinating conjunctions, okay? And in good news, all three of the example sentences I gave you are correct the way they are, okay? They're all correctly punctuated. I had a dependent, comma, independent. That was fine. I had a dependent in the dead middle of the sentence, and it had double commas on either side of it, and that's correct, because interruptions get a comma before and a comma after. And in sentence 3, the dependent clause happened second, and I didn't put a comma. And that's how it should be. So thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful. I look forward to seeing you practice and helping you further if needed.